Hey, thank you, Stephen, for the invite here. It is a pleasure to be part of the Church Online Summit. A guy who has dedicated the majority of his life, a big chunk of his life, you know what? I'll go and say it. The majority of his life in helping churches figure out how to get online and what online ministry can look like. It's a pleasure, even in this COVID season, to be here connecting with people from across the here America and around the world on how to do church online better. And so I can consider it an honor and a privilege to be here, even connecting with you all virtually through the season. My name is Jeff Reed, and so I run a company called theChurch.digital. We'll get more into that here in a little bit, but the heart of what I wanted to talk about today is how we do the Great Commission digitally. As a church, God, Jesus, when he was here, some of his last words were to go and make disciples. I'm reading here from the Bible app open on my phone, on my iPad. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded of you. And surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. What does that even look like in digital context? These are some of the things we're going to wrestle with here in this coming season. By the way, in this coming presentation, I do a lot of slides, and in there I also have a lot of URLs that are available for other resources. The slide deck is completely available for you to download right now at thechurch.digital/summit. So go to thechurch.digital/summit, download this slide note. You can have it accessible for you to watch, live in the session. If you're doing the on-demand, which I hope you do, that's awesome. Have all of this content available to share with your staff, with your volunteer teams. It's a phenomenal conference, and jump on that. But download that, thechurch.digital/summit, to get the slide deck here with this. Here's where we are. Here's who I am. My name is Jeff Reed, like I said. 20 years experience doing church. Honestly, it's either been working for churches or working with companies that are working alongside churches, helping ministry happen. A lot of my church contacts has been multi-site, megachurch, gigachurch, large churches, doing some things there. Production director, creative director, communications director, weekend experience director, online pastor, digital strategist. I go through a lot of job profiles. It's cool. I solve problems for churches, and I've loved being and doing what I'm doing in ministry. But it's interesting. About 2 years ago, April 2018, God actually led me to step aside from ministry, to step out of a ministry position, and instead start a company called The Church Digital, where we literally help churches figure out how to do church online, whether it's through one-on-one consulting or cohorts, or even doing blogging and podcasting, all sorts of resources that are available to help churches figure out how to do church online, how to do ministry online better. Recently, January 2020, I was hired as Director of Digital Church Planting by Stadia Church Planting. If you don't know Stadia, they've launched, they've planted, they've grown 1,000 churches literally around the world. And so they are a church planting organization. And they approached me late last year, early this year, about coming on staff with them and creating a model of digital church, a church that wasn't necessarily locked into a physical location, but instead could exist completely digitally. And it was funny, pre-COVID, that was a very controversial idea. You can't do church online. Are you kidding? What are you talking about? That's crazy. I even had churches go as far as to tell me, a pastor tell me once, that it was a theological concern, major issues. Jeff, you are sinning by helping people watch services online instead of being together in the corporate body. It is a sin, Jeff, for what you're doing. By the way, that was a friend of mine who told me that. So I actually respect the guy for having the courage to tell me. I don't agree with him, of course. And it was ironic. In the COVID season, a couple months after I made that statement, he actually called me back up. He's like, hey, Jeff, yeah, COVID, yeah, we're panicking over here. Can you come over and help us set up a broadcast? What does that look like? I don't think that COVID actually changed the Bible. I don't remember seeing that on the symptom list. So I don't think it's a theological issue necessarily that we had, but I do think there were a lot of people who are now reanalyzing their opinions of church online and whether or not it's biblical or not. But we're gonna get into that here in a little bit. Let's back up and let's even define, because I'm a big linguist. I like words, and especially when we're talking about edgy things, I like for the words to have meaning and understanding. So let's just go through this. Let's define what church means. Okay, this is a little elementary. Forgive me here. Let's define church. At the ground level, church is biblically, it's ecclesia. It's the gathering of people. By the way, there's tons of different models of church. These are all just models. Mega church, multi-site, giga, micro church, micro hub church, church plants, small church, the modern church. Wherever you are right now in your definition of what you call church, it's a model of church. Korea right now is seeing almost a revival. Well, pre-COVID, they're almost seeing a revival happening through a giga church movement. Some of the largest churches in the country or in the world come out of Korea. On the flip side, you've got India, who's seeing a movement start and spread like wildfire centered around house churches. Not even house churches. These are guys that are meeting under a palm tree. And they're seeing this huge movement happening in mud huts and palm trees, not at the giga level with tens of thousands of people gathering together, but at a much smaller level, at 3s or 5s. And to say that God is not able to move in the giga or even in the micro is crazy. Really, the models are just a picture and a model of what we want to be, what God calls us to be, what the Bible calls the church to be, but that's just it. It's a model. It's a taste of it. What the Bible calls us to be is sometimes it's much different. Here's where we are. This is church functions as defined by Larry Walkemeyer and Todd Wilson, mobilization flywheel. It's a very short list. I like it because it's concise and I don't have a lot of time. If you want to dig into this, go hit up Acts 2. Start there. Find the 10 elements that we are called to be by reading the second half of Acts 2. It's in there. It's rich. You'll love it. Go hang out at Acts 2. But for us, for the purposes here, they wrote this book, Mobilization Flywheel. Here's what we're looking at for a church. Jesus is worshipped as Lord. Scripture is taught and obeyed. Believers are gathered regularly for fellowship and prayer. Sacraments are practiced. Spiritual authority is present, credible, and active within the church. God's mission, disciple making, and servanthood. And these are core priorities of it. And finally, the presence of the Spirit is active within the gathering. So when we look at our churches, do we see that pre-COVID? I think so. I think the physical churches were representative of that. If we look holistically only at our church onlines, do we see this? Do we? Pre-COVID, like even the whole like sacraments, how many churches were doing communion online? Was it really a holistic church, or was it just part of something smaller? Was it part of the physical that we're just kind of mirroring over? It's interesting when you look at the scope, God's mission, disciple making and servanthood, how is that represented in church online? The presence of the Spirit is active in this gathering and moving through. Yes, this Holy Spirit can move through Zoom. I got to tell you, it's a beautiful thing when the Holy Spirit connects people through virtual technology. Do we, the church pre-COVID, do we believe it? Do we believe it mid-COVID? As we're coming out of this COVID season, allegedly coming out of this COVID season, heading into whatever the next normal is, and before the next wave of COVID 2.0 hits maybe in the fall, do we believe that we can do these things in digital space? This is really the question that I want to ask. Because when we look at what a church online is, let's define church online. The average person would say the church online is the broadcasting of the church on Sunday. That was literally the conversation that I had with hundreds of pastors pre-COVID. It's not centered around discipleship. It's not centered around evangelism. A lot of those things we weren't even doing pre-COVID. The percentage of churches, there maybe 10% of churches were broadcasting their services online pre-COVID. The number of churches that were actually doing some level of discipleship, online small groups, a fraction of that was going to that next level. Here's where we are. The average church does not consider discipleship part of church online. We've got an opportunity here to look at doing what I'm calling a digital church. And this is a reimagining a church. We're going to get more into this in a bit, but it's a digital church is an expression not of the physical church recreated, but it's a reimagining of it. Church, we've been doing this for a little bit in this season. Some of you have changed your service links. Hey, you know what? People really aren't going to connect with that 75-minute service. They're not able to. Hey, you know what, Pastor? I love your sermons, 40 minutes, 45, 50 minutes. Your sermons are awesome. People, man, they're struggling to connect with that virtually. What if we change the service length? What if we change the sermon length? Hey, Pastor, you got 40 minutes of message? Well, and this is a crazy idea. What if you preach that sermon 3, 4, 5 days out of the week? What if you turned it into devotional snippets that were able to catch people where they were and make it more shareable and easy for people to digest, to ingest, and to move from the head to the heart? What if instead of once a week we did constant? I mean, shoot, Acts 2 talks about that. The gathering of believers daily. What does that look like in a digital context? Well, what if we took it a step further and not just looked at doing what we were doing physically and changing it to digital? What if we did something completely different? What if we looked at our physical communities and figured out how to create disciples digitally and unleash them to go? What if we looked at how we're creating people and unleashing them to get reach their circle of influence in ways that we haven't thought of? Go and make disciples doesn't necessarily mean, church, go to the ends of the earth. It means let's start with people who can talk with other people, who can talk with other people, and we multiply. We multiply to the ends of the earth. It's a scalability in the digital world is fascinating. Here's some lessons that we've learned, and let's dive straight into some lessons here. All right, online to offline. By the way, if you're not listening to Jay Cranda, his talk, do it. If it's already happened, pay the money, get the annual thing. It's going to be well worth it. Here's where we are, online to offline. The gospel that this changed my life. This one principle, once I understood it and moved from the head to the heart, this redefined everything for me in context of online. The gospel that we learn in our online world, it has to affect our offline relationships. The gospel that we learn in church online, it has to influence who we are physically, who our audience is physically, who our attenders are physically. If the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. If this is evident in Facebook, if it's evident in my emails, but who I am in physical space, who I am to my wife, to my kids, to my coworkers, to my neighbors, if I'm an a-hole to them, who am I? At best, I'm a hypocrite. And do we need to go even beyond that? The content that we're creating, the services that we're showing, the devotional thoughts, the social media, all of this needs to not just go to the head, it needs to go to the heart and eventually to the hands. We need to be motivating people to do things in the real world. Move beyond just this online presence of content, but instead start measuring how effective we are at keeping people on mission, even through digital methods. Without impact, without fruit, like evangelism, like discipleship, even just the basic fruits of the Spirit, we're creating consumers. Go into all the world, teach the nations, baptize them. There's activity. Teach them to obey everything that I've commanded of you. That's activity. It's not just knowledge. It comes to the heart and to the hands of it. Here's another challenge that we see in church online. You out there, audience, summit people, you're probably feeling this at some level. High tech, high touch. Vice versa, I've been corrected. High touch, high tech. You see, in this tech world that we live in, technology is very cold. It's distant. And you have to work hard to overcome that. I'm literally sitting in my guest bedroom right now. There's like a guest bed right there. I'm staring into a lens. There is literally no one in this room but me. This is a very cold environment. Yeah, I tried to decorate it. I got this really nice lens. I love this lens that's on this camera. I'm trying to make it feel a little warmer. Even the color temperature on the lights, I wish it was a little warmer now. It feels a little cold. You have to work hard to overcome the coldness of technology. Which is why if you're an online pastor, dude, I would rather see you be a small groups pastor, a highly relational person than just a tech guy. Not that there's anything wrong with the tech, but you've got to overcome that coldness of technology so much. Tech is the means to the end and not the end in itself. And it's so easy for us as church online people to get our eyes on the newest gear, the newest fad, the newest trend, the newest thing that's out there. And those things are nice. But by doing that, sometimes we lose our vision on the overall mission that we're trying to do, which is to go and make disciples. How effective is that fad in helping us get there? Do we need to do other things instead that are more effective? Here's what I know. In 2020, we're especially feeling this right now in this COVID season. Engagement, the word engagement's lost definition. Here's what I believe it is. It's a two-way conversation. It's not one way, it's two-way. I am not engaging with you right now. It's a fact. I'm staring at a camera. There's not a two-way conversation. I wish we were sitting at Starbucks, Panera, choose your coffee house. I would literally be drinking an iced coffee right now. And I wish I was having a conversation with you directly about this. No, I have a much larger reach towards it, and that's awesome. But when it comes to disciple making, when it comes to life change, oftentimes we find that the one-way conversation is not as effective as a two-way. And so sometimes you need to have that physical accountability, even within digital relationships, to hold someone accountable for what they're doing. And because it's physical accountability or virtual accountability, either way, there's accountability towards it. Don't automate discipleship out of the equation. The human, the skin part of who we are actually makes us very relational in those accountability settings. And by engaging in people and by listening to them, by dialoguing through things, we're adding value to them instead of, I'm going to go and say it, preaching at them via one-way communication. Because we also know this. In 2020, it's better to ask questions than to make statements. Allowing people to speak in, meeting them where they are instead of forcing them to meet where you are, is a key component in allowing your church online to be effective. You want to make disciples, you got to start where people are. And sometimes you can do that via one-way communication and expect them to step up. But it's far more effective to have a two-way conversation and to draw people in. Sometimes people connect to community before we connect to Christ. We do see this a lot in church online. Maybe you can relate with me. I would love if you can relate to this. Hit me up on social media. It's DearFetch. Have this conversation with me. I really wish we were at a Starbucks somewhere talking right now. But here's the fact. I've seen it. Other online pastors have seen it that I've talked with. In online environments, people will connect, often they'll connect to community before they connect to Christ. Lifeway 2016 had this stat. 63% of people are not interested in going to a building to grow spiritually. Lifeway tells us this in the same report. 79% of people will talk about faith with their friends if they see that faith is important to their friends. And so you want to change someone's life, you have the conversation as a friend within community. It's not preaching from a soapbox. It's engaging relationally in having those conversations. That's where we want to be. Church, that's who we're called to be. We're called to be the people that are having the conversations. And then when we get those life change, we're called to duplicate ourselves into someone else and then allow them to go and have those same conversations. Multiplication is better than addition. This is going to be a hard truth to wrestle through because some of us come from big churches. Is it better to have a 1 million person church or 100,000 churches of 10? This is going to be a weird thing, and some of you are going to call me on this, but it's cool. Let's just talk it through. The strength of a digital church or the strength of church online is not broadcasting a one-way message to a whole bunch of people. Our strength is discipling and building smaller relationships that multiply. Bear with me here. Let's talk about Billy Graham. I love Billy Graham. Who does not love Billy Graham? Billy Graham, 1995. One message, one sermon, preached live, was bounced off 30 satellites, a number of different translators doing it live. One sermon, 30 satellites, 165 countries around the world, Literally 1 billion people heard a message preached from Billy Graham. This was 1995. AOL? I have to go back in the time. I think AOL maybe hit the scene 1993. Maybe AOL was around, but this is really pre a lot of okay, Netscape. There you go. Netscape was a thing in 1995. Here's what I know. That's old technology. And I love Billy for being the innovative man that he was to utilize the technology the best way possible to reach as many as possible. The fact that I'm talking to people around the world right now isn't as cool as the fact that I can jump in a Zoom and we can have a conversation right now. 5, 6, 8, 10 of us can build a relationship, a two-way conversation. In 1995, I was paying 30 cents a minute for state-to-state, long distance to talk to my girlfriend, now wife. Technology's changed. It's not one way, it's two-way. And the more that we utilize this technology to connect with people and then unleash them on mission, that's how we make disciples. It's through us multiplying ourselves into others who multiply it into others. Let's look at this. I love this. We're digging deep here. This is Seth Godin, okay? Worldwide, one of the best marketers in the world. We all know Seth Godin. If you don't know Seth Godin, Google Seth Godin. There you go. You're welcome. Buy a book. Here's where we are. On his podcast, somebody asked him, how do I get my message heard around the world? Now, what the guy was actually asking is, what social media platforms are the most viable at this point that people still engage with literally around the world? It's not the question Seth answered. What Seth answered was basically this. What's the smallest viable audience that you can connect with? It's not 1 billion people. It's not 100 million. It's not 10 million. It's not million. Maybe it's not even 100,000, 10,000. What's the smallest number of people? And start there. And then you know what happens after you start with the small number? It grows. See, that's the challenge. This is the irony of this, where Seth Godin, he's Jewish. Seth Godin is literally describing the Christian discipleship relationship that we need to have with others, where we can multiply this out and allow others to understand it and allow it to multiply and multiply and multiply. Rather than the church trying to reach 1 billion people, what if we just reached 1 who reached 10, who reached 10, who reached 10? You know, I seem to remember there was somebody in the Bible who had like 12 followers that would go through that. It's just an incredible opportunity for us to engage in small and then multiply via the Great Commission. Here's where we are. This is a fact. Easter 2020 stat. I'm not going to tell you the name of the church. One church, 500,000 viewers online as well as through television. That's huge, right? 500,000 people are engaging and watching the service content. When it actually comes to like collecting information on how to drive these people, get these people connected into ministry, figuring out what next steps are, opportunities to pray and engage, have some two-way conversations, literally meaning engaging with people, they collected 11 connection cards. 500,000 viewers, 11 connection cards. I'm bad at math, but that's probably 499,989 consumers. Like I said, I am bad at math, but I think that's right. Sometimes it's difficult when you have these massive numbers to figure out who these people are, when in fact we shouldn't be looking at the physical numbers. We should be looking at a much smaller group and then allowing it to grow. Look at this quote from Alan Hirsch. You can create a stronger movement with 12 disciples rather than 1,200 consumers. I'd add a 0 to that, 12,000 consumers. I'd add a whole bunch of zeros to that, because at the end of the day, if all we're doing is consuming content and it's not exuding itself into real life, we're a consumer. You're not going to start a movement. You're not going to change lives off of consuming a product. Church Online, that's the challenge for us today, is how do we find these 12 people? So the typical church process is this. I call it 1, 2, 3. Every church has some sort of strategy, and there's probably 3 or 4 buzzwords within your church, you plug in and fit in the ones where they are. Typically, one, let's call it first base, is the gathering of a large group of people in a church service. Typically, number two is some sort of breaking them down into small groups. That's second base. Third base is training them to be on mission, make them disciple makers, blah, 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 whatever. Maybe it's a diamond or a triangle instead of a baseball diamond. You figure it out. Maybe your order is different. At the end of the day, probably that on mission disciple maker one is last. And so the physical church gathers them at this point in big services and has to figure out who they are. They do it out in the lobby. Hey, if you need prayer, come see me. Hey, there's a big banner. If you want to join a small group, come over here. There's loud music. There's excitement. We get guest services, grabbing, pulling over. How do you do that in church online? You really have to work hard to do that in church online. It's funny, when I took the job with Stadia, like I wrestled a lot with this, but when I came to Stadia and I shared this, my boss, his name's Craig at Stadia, he says, Jeff, well, of course, but because you're doing it backwards. He says, Jeff, when you're planning a church, when you're starting a movement, the first thing you do isn't gather them into large groups. The first thing you do is find the people who are on mission, train them to be disciple makers, and then unleash them online. That's the first step. The first thing they do is get people on mission and then unleash them on the circle of influence and grow yourself into small groups. Grow yourself into services, online services. That's a far healthier process to be on. And what's interesting in me, and I'll just be transparent here in a moment because all I'm doing is talking to a camera lens, I struggled with this. When I was on church staff, when I was like you, I struggled with this idea of how to get people out of first base. How do I discover who these thousands of people are that are watching these services in isolation? I wrote up a book. There's a book that talks about this in greater detail. thechurch.digital/grows up. It's a free ebook. It talks about church online groups, micro-locations, disciple-making processes, all through Christ Fellowship Miami. It was an awesome church. It was an awesome time. But I'm being honest. I struggled to make that 1, 2, 3 approach work. It's so hard to find who people are. It's so much easier when we get people on mission and then allow them to reach their circle of influence and allow them to reach their circle of influence. And all of a sudden, you find yourself growing at a multiplication level, at a much healthier foundation than what we would do even at the other approach. DJ Soto, VR Church, lead pastor, phenomenal guy, vrchurch.org. If you're not tracking with them, one of the few guys, he's got 3 churches on virtual reality, alt VR, literally on 3 different continents, North America, Europe, as well as Asia Pacific. It's time to stop replicating physical church digitally. And it's time to start reimagining a digital church. And so if we want to go and make disciples of all nations and figure out how to do it digitally, then I think sometimes we need to do things differently. A church planner, they're not going to do 1, 2, 3. They're going to do 3, 2, 1. A healthy digital church planning is going to meet people. It's going to get them on mission. It's going to mobilize them to reach a circle of influence and repeat and multiply through that. What if we, in the season, looked at it differently? What would it look like to utilize our church online, to utilize digital-only expressions of church? What would it be if our churches acted not as a physical church, but as a phygital church, operating both physically and digitally equally together? What if our social media was driven towards engagement, two-way conversations, where we are effectively going and making disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Holy Spirit, teaching them in the ways that I have told you? We got to go from the head. We got to get to people's hearts. And through that, we got to drive to people's hands. That's where the movement comes. That's where the Great Commission is fulfilled, even in this post-COVID society. Thank you.